Welcome to the Maintainable Software Podcast, where we explore the art of improving existing software with seasoned practitioners who have helped organizations overcome the problems often associated with technical debt and legacy code. I'm your host, Robby Russell. On this episode, Stig Brautaset, who is currently a staff software engineer at CircleCI, joins us. Stig joins us from the north of England. Stig Brautaset, we're so glad to have you join us on Maintainable. Welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
So as you reflect on your experience in the industry, what do you believe are a few common characteristics of, dare I say, well-maintained software?
I think it is very much dependent on the team, because one team's maintainable software can be another team's nightmare. It's to do with the team's experience level of domain knowledge, and even appetite for risk, I would say. And it boils down to if the team is confident in making changes that doesn't cause incident and doesn't take abnormally long, or it's kind of predictably takes a predictable amount of time to make changes, I think that's probably well-maintained enough software.
You know, I want to dig into that a little bit when you're talking about appetite for risk in particular. Do you feel like that is something that only happens after people have a certain amount of years or some amount of experience where they can feel more confident? Or have you also witnessed teams that might have people that maybe are a lot less experience, maybe like I'm trying to come up with a objective way to define that, I suppose, but in terms of they're like overly confident because they're still kind of maybe earlier on as a team, or how do you balance that? Where do you see that kind of sitting in that kind of perspective?
I reckon it's probably a soft bell curve where you might be a bit overconfident in the beginning, then you get a bit more conservative, shall we say, and then once you have a lot more knowledge and history with it, you might feel more confident about taking risks because you have learned all the failure modes of the software and you're confident in the software's ability to recover. So, yeah, I think it probably changes over time. I definitely remember being rather bullish early on in my career.
I think about how I've worked with people, and I don't know what it's like to work with me, like from a different person's perspective, I suppose, but I've worked with a number of engineers over the years, and I've always thought there was this interesting, I think you talk about like a soft bell curve where there's this, what am I doing? I don't think I know what I'm doing. And then like, I know what I'm doing now. I'm very, very confident about what I'm doing. And then you get to a point where like, I don't know that I'm actually that confident after all. And it kind of like this over the arc of someone's career, at least maybe in those first like 10 years or so. I'm also curious about, thinking about one team's nightmare as another team's like maybe paradise or something of like what they're getting to work on. Have you had a lot of experience where you've come into situations where it was a nightmare for you at first and then you realize, okay, it actually wasn't that bad? Or
I don't think I have. I feel like I've been quite lucky. At this job, I didn't know Clojure when I joined, and all our software was in Clojure. So it was quite difficult because I was paired with two very senior engineers, and I felt quite a lot out of my depth. But it's the job that I've stayed in the longest. It's the only one I didn't at least try and find a job elsewhere after 3 years. So it's treating me fairly well.
That's great. I'm curious about when a company like, say, CircleCI has a job posting, was it that they knew that there weren't maybe necessarily a lot of Clojure developers, or was that not a large requirement for that part of that process? Or I'm always curious about how different organizations think about that.
I don't know if that was a concern at the time. I think I started just before the kind of hyper growth stage we had. And there was a time when the vast majority of the software was written in Clojure. That is not anymore the case. And difficulty in hiring experienced Clojure developers was a concern. I happen to very much like it. I would have liked to have some stronger types.
I know that you wrote a blog post titled Alien Artifacts, where you introduced a subcategory of legacy code. Can you introduce this concept to our listeners? And I'll include links to your blog post in the show notes for people.
Yeah, I think it was actually something that I've seen a few times, and I call it Alien Artifacts. I think I didn't actually come up with the name before. I think I mentioned that in the footnotes. But it's a particularly complicated piece of legacy software written by very smart engineers that are no longer working for the company, so you can't ask them to help you with it. It works really well for what it was designed to, but it's highly resistant to change. And it's kind of different from most legacy code in that it's probably well documented, well tested, etc., but it's still really difficult to change, and it's probably because of either some esoteric languages used or esoteric techniques, or it requires a lot of domain knowledge or various other things. There's an example somebody came up with when I posted this on a link sharing website of TeX, the software, the typesetting software, which generates DVI, device independent something. I can't remember what the acronym stands for. And so this is a characteristic of alien software. You end up with an accretion disk of tools that transform the inputs and outputs before they go to the tool, because changing the tool is so hard. So you have all of these PS to PDF tools or stuff like that, because it generates a PostScript, and then you transform that into PDFs, because getting it to spit out PDF in the first place is difficult,
And so you have to end up scenarios like that where you're chaining together a bunch of tools to get the job done. And do you think that's a good example of projects also being very, very specific about what they do and not trying to account for all the different things? And be like, well, you can daisy chain this as part of your workflow. This thing should only do X and come out with Y, and then you can do what you want from that. Even though you probably know most people that are trying to use the thing in the first place are probably just trying to generate a PDF, maybe.
Yeah. I think there are some other examples too, like the famous sendmail config, which was so arcane that they tended to ship it with M4 macros, and then that became the documented way of doing sendmail config. I used to work in a bank, and we had some mainframe systems, mainframe jobs, and we did a lot of data massaging for stuff to get into the format that the mainframe job would handle, and then spit it out, and then some more massaging of the output, And I suppose there's a sense of, you could consider it some ETL kind of process, right? But there are cases where, and so not all of these cases might be bad, but there are cases where probably the software should just deal with this format, but it's not actually very easy to get it to do that, so you have an intermediate step instead.
How does someone know, or for listeners, if they're wondering, what would be something how might they identify if they have alien artifacts already in their code base, outside of it being maybe just something esoteric that some I'm air quoting genius wrote a decade ago and everybody's afraid to break it?
When even experienced engineers of considerable seniority and skill require several attempts at making significant changes. And it's not because of lack of tests or lack of documentation or things like that. It's just very difficult to work with code base, not because the code base is bad, but because it's probably quite domain dependent. And it's kind of difficult. I haven't actually seen that many of them. There's one that I can think of. Somebody mentioned tech, which I thought sounded like a good one, although, as you mentioned, maybe all the massaging in and out is actually not necessarily bad. But what I've heard of tech is that it is extremely difficult to work with, because the source is using this literate programming style. So the source code is embedded in the documentation, so you have to run a tool to extract the source. So, which means that none of and it's written, I think even then, it's written in a dialect of Pascal that isn't really very common. Maybe you shouldn't quote me on that. I hope that wasn't a false memory. But I've heard that it's very difficult to work with that code base. I can imagine, I used to do literate programming stuff for my configuration in the past. The problem is that none of the tools that you want to jump to definition and that kind of stuff works, right? So it's very difficult to work with a big code base. It's great if you write it once and then don't really maintain it and or you can read the config. It worked so fairly well for my Emacs config, but I can imagine that it's very difficult to jump into, because you not only have to get used to this language that it's actually written in, you have to get used to this meta language that it's used for the literate programming part and stuff like that. So this, at my current job, that inspired this alien artifact blog post, which is one of only 2 that have made it to Hacker News front page. I'm quite proud of that. But I can't actually think of any others from previous jobs, and I have been in this for 20 years now in this business, so they're rare. I think that that was one of the things I found quite amusing. The comments on the post, people were commenting, "Oh yeah, I wrote an alien artifact last week," or "I've written several of them," and I'm thinking, I don't think you should take that as a badge of pride. You should probably stop and think about that, because to me, it isn't. It feels like a bit of a failing, maybe not on an individual level, but on a business level, to allow such a thing to be created.
Hey folks, it's me, Robby. I want you to take a moment and close your eyes. Now picture your code and your applications as a symphony. Now to keep that symphony playing smoothly, you need an orchestra of tools. That's where our podcast sponsor, AppSignal, takes center stage. They combine the elegance of error tracking, the precision of performance monitoring, and the harmony of logging into one symphonic suite. Whether you're composing with Ruby, jamming with Elixir, orchestrating with Node.js, or harmonizing with Python, or maybe even a little bit of flourish of JavaScript, AppSignal's got the sheet music for you. And here's the crescendo. Plans start at just $23 US a month. That's got to be music to your budget's ears. Plus, they're certified ISO 27001, and they dance the GDPR and HIPAA compliance beats. So don't miss a beat, my friends. Head on over to appsignal.com and tell them that your good friend Robby from Maintainable sent you. Now, open your eyes and let the symphony of smooth coding begin. Let's get back to our show. In your experience with, over the years, and you've said you've come across a couple of these, and then thinking about people that replied or posted comments in reply to your article, do you get the sense that those things happen with a lot of thumbs up or approval from the business side of things, or does that tend to be something that you think maybe some alien developer just kind of went over into the corner and made this thing happen, got something done, and they were really proud of it, they organized it, documented, wrote tests for it, and to look at my beautiful piece of art? How do you feel like it's kind of in that spectrum, or is just, how do these things materialize?
I think part of the problem is a bubble effect. When you have really very high-skilled teams, maybe just very top-heavy, very high skill, very high seniority, perhaps domain knowledge, and they're perhaps not aware. Maybe, what's that curse of knowledge? Maybe they have the curse of knowledge. They're not aware that what they're making is so hard for others, or mere mortals, to work with. The artifact in our question is written in a language we use, but it makes extensive use of a library that is basically a DSL, which looks quite different to the rest of the language, so it feels very foreign, and unless you work with that quite a lot, it's not easy to work with.
It's something that I'm also curious to learn more about. While preparing for our discussion, I learned that you work on an open source library, maybe multiple, where you've gone out of your way to allow developers to use different major versions of that library within the same application. Could you share that story with our listeners? Like, why?
Yes. Why? Well, yes. The library in question is SBJSON, which is an Objective-C JSON parser and generator. I started writing that when I was made redundant in 2007. I was kept on just to the company was, or everyone in the company was being made redundant. We were a subsidiary of a different company, and our projects were being transferred to a different consultancy. So I was kept on as a support person in case they needed some help during that transition period. But I didn't really have any responsibility, so I was just hacking on my own projects in there. And I actually wanted to hack on CouchDB bindings for the Mac, but it uses JSON, and I couldn't find a JSON library that I liked, so I thought I'd write one. How hard could it be? Took me 10 years to get UTF-8 parsing to work right. I never got back to working on the CouchDB bindings. I ended up just working on the JSON library. Now, it got quite popular, which meant that Facebook shipped it in their Facebook SDK, which many people used. And that made it very hard for me. They weren't very keen on updating the version that they had. And that made it very hard for me to get users to upgrade the version that they had or they used. They wanted a new feature, but they couldn't upgrade because they also used the Facebook SDK and it conflicted with the symbols in my library. So I had to find a way around that. And I couldn't really do silly linker tricks because most people would just include the source code of my library in their app. So I had to do something that worked at a really low level, and I did the simplest thing that could possibly work. I renamed all the symbols to contain a version number. So it had the class would be SBJSON 4. I think I had 3, 4, 5. By being diligent about that, it was a pain to backport changes because of all those class name changes and nums and that kind of type def changes and stuff like that. It was an absolute pain to backport fixes, but it meant that you could actually have version 3, 4, and 5 in the same app at the same time in different stages of migration, which was one of the things I did to try and accommodate people evolving their applications in the face of this unmoving version that Facebook kept shipping.
Did Facebook did they start using your version one at some point, or were you able to, or did you have to support not only these different versions that you introduced, or maybe I'm making an assumption that you introduced like the numbers into your library after Facebook started doing that, and then so they never took advantage of that, or to your knowledge?
I don't actually know if they took advantage of that. I didn't manage to get in contact with anyone who could, who had control over that. I did get an invite to the Mobile at Scale in London from Facebook, and I know that was because the developer or engineer who arranged that had used my library, but I don't think he had used it I'm not sure he had used it at Facebook. There was another trick I used in the source code, because I don't know how familiar you are with Cocoa or Objective-C, but there was a change when they brought in ARC, automatic reference counting, in Objective-C. So you didn't have to... I made a change to use that, which cut a lot of source code in my library. And then I started getting reports about people saying... They didn't tell me, but they were moaning on various blogs and on Stack Overflow that it had terrible memory leaks, and that's because they copied their source into their project but didn't specify that these source code files must be compiled with automatic reference counting. So it just allocated memory and never released it. So I had to add some preprocessor things to the source code so that it would just refuse to compile. It would error out if you tried to compile it without automatic reference counting. But it was frustrating. I also tried to ship binary libraries, but shipping binary versions, because now it's possible because Apple doesn't have that many different architectures. But it was still getting harder and harder once they started getting iPad and Mac OS and iPhone, and then it was quite difficult. So I kind of stopped doing that.
There's something I hadn't planned on asking you about, but since you brought up like people using the tools that you've worked on over the years and talking about them in different places, how does that seeing activity, whether that's happening within your project's repository, I'm assuming that's on GitHub or something like that, like people participating in that space versus where people are having other places people might be having conversations about interacting or using the tools that you've been involved in. How does that help motivate you that they're seeing that other people are doing it, or do you have questions like, why am I doing this very often? I say this as someone that also has open source project that a lot of people talk about in a lot of different places. It's mostly good, sometimes not so good. What's been your kind of take on that over the years?
I've found it quite frustrating a lot of the time. I've had a couple of people thanking me, and I had a couple of pints or bought for me as a thank you for writing it, and that's great. I've not had a lot of engagement. There's been limited interaction. I don't feel that I've been extremely good at building a community around it. So it's usually somebody with reporting a bug, in which case, and I would have tried to fix it. And sometimes I don't recognize that this is a bug. Then they will often get a bit defensive, I've found it. To me, it was kind of therapy. I'd never actually used the library myself. So for me, it was I only really wrote it. And it was an intellectual exercise for me. Particularly, I dipped into it when my work life wasn't very interesting or a bit kind of stressful and not very programmy. But I've had a couple of jobs as a direct result of writing this library. But I've had it's been generally good, but it definitely has been a source of frustration as well. And as I mentioned earlier, when I thought the library was basically done, reported a bug and showed that and initially I didn't believe them. They showed that I didn't handle UTF-8 correctly, and they reported a crash in UTF-8. I learned a lot about UTF-8, and I did fix that, and I did add kind of fuzzing to make sure that I could not reproduce any more crashes and I don't think this happened very much still. I occasionally download Xcode to see what new warnings it has and then see if I could patch that fairly easily. And that's about it, really. It's pretty much done. A JSON parser shouldn't be that difficult to do. I've been tried to be very strict about not including anything that isn't in the JSON spec, because that's a slippery slope. If you start doing that, then you can never be done, right? But in this case, because the spec is so simple, I can say that I am done.
We'll be back with our interview with Stig in just a moment. Hi, it's me, Robby. I just wanted to take a quick moment to say thank you for listening to the podcast. If you're finding these conversations valuable, please consider sharing a link amongst your peers and/or writing a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify to help spread the word. Also, is there someone you think I should be having on the podcast at some point? Shoot me an email to Robby with a Y at maintainable.fm and state your case. And now, let's get back to our interview with Stig Brautaset. I'm not that familiar with the JSON spec. Has that been something that has evolved a few times? And
it's pretty static as far as I understand. I think there's been an update to the RFC at some point where they tightened one thing, but the spec itself, it fits basically on a business card. It's a very simple spec. You can find it on json.org. Partly that is causing some problems too. It's basically the spec is basically what does JavaScript do in some things, right? So it's very underspecified, particularly number handling, because it's not really specified how to deal with numbers with higher precision than you could, or what kind of precision they're supposed to have and what kind of range of numbers. So I think most people tend to just default to IEEE double precision floating point numbers because that's the only number type that JavaScript has. But I do some special handling in the library to detect if the number doesn't have any decimal points and then treat it like an integer. And also because a long and unsigned long has higher range than the range you get from a double. So somebody posted a thing where I had a off by one error in integers. It tried to read one integer and it actually returned another. And this was because it read it as it did a conversion via double, and it ended up not being accurate enough. So I ended up having to inspect the underlying data type to see did it had any full decimal point, and if not, no, I know it's an integer, so I can use long integer.
That's interesting. Do you, I didn't go look around the code base in SBJSON. What sort of approaches do you take for handling? Do you do a lot of automated testing in that type of environment? And what sort of tools do you kind of lean on? I come from a different web framework background, so.
So the spec comes with some example documents that you have to handle, and it has a reference test suite. So I used I copied that, and then I think I found there was another parser that I was using in Perl, I think, that I asked the author if I could copy that test suite, I seem to remember. Because the test suite is written in JSON, so it's kind of, I could copy that. And then I added some for myself, and then every time I fixed a bug, I added a new test case, obviously. So it's generally, the tests are written in JSON, which is the kind of...
Let's take a quick moment to plug your employer, CircleCI. So for those that aren't familiar with CircleCI, I would be surprised if people weren't that familiar with it, but what does CircleCI provide developers and development teams?
We are the industry leader in continuous integration and continuous deployment. And our CTO also does a podcast, which might be interesting to your listeners, called The Confident Commit. I know that when I started in this industry in 2003, we did not use CI. But nowadays, I can't even imagine starting a hobby project without CI. I feel it's ubiquitous in the circles that I move in, at least. But I am being told that it isn't everywhere. So I'm finding it difficult to fathom. But obviously, I've been here for 4.5 years, and it's all I live and breathe here. So it's difficult to imagine not having this kind of tool.
In particular, you mentioned the confident commit podcast. Is that a like interview style type podcast, or is it just your CTO at CircleCI just ranting and raving about?
It is our CTO interviewing many other business leaders. So it's often a CTO to CTO or chat. And I would probably characterize it more as what people are doing with CI and what people that are using CI would perhaps accomplish. It's not typically how to do CI specifically in the podcast.
I'll definitely include links to that in the show notes for our listeners so they can check it out. I'm curious also, another thing, preparing for our conversation, and I know that it's important to you that, or at least you have a kind of a sentiment that you believe software developers should be responsible for the services once they get shipped to production. Could you share a little bit more about that and what you mean by that?
I don't particularly enjoy being on call, but I do think it is the responsible thing to be on call for the software you maintain. I can't really, I think it's hard to even claim that you are maintaining software if you're not on call for it. But it's definitely something that could burn you out. If the conditions are not such that you can actually improve the software. I have worked in a place where I just had to support a piece of software, but we weren't allowed to improve it. We just were on fire damage duty whenever it broke, and we couldn't fix the problems that we knew about. And that was I got very burnt out from that. But at the same time, I worked in a place where people did not maintain the software that they shipped. And it ended up coloring the way that they wrote features, and we ended up having features that couldn't really be shipped because the way the feature was implemented, it required downtime, so they hadn't thought about how the deployment would look, and it required too much downtime, but the software was 24/7 running, and it was an e-commerce site. We had a counter of basically downtime was very costly. We had a counter up on a screen in the office showing kind of the real-time orders as they came in, and if the software were down, that stopped, and that was very expensive. So there were features that were as written could not be deployed and ended up being backed out. I suspect that came from the developers writing that feature disconnected from actually deploying that and maintaining that or supporting that in production.
Yeah, I can see how that could be really complicated for teams to navigate. And then have you seen some good patterns develop because of, okay, now that developers are, say I'm air quoting, on call or needing to be accountable for what's happening in production right now, that they can think about how to navigate that stuff from the very how early in that process of building a new feature do you think we should be like, exactly how are we going to ship this?
I'm not sure I actually have a good one there because it's tough, right? You take on debt because at the early stages, the important thing is finding market fit and actually building a product that anybody would want, right? And so there are things that you maybe know that this isn't ideal, but it doesn't matter if it doesn't get popular, because it costs money to do this right now that I could better spend on trying to actually make it work or make it popular. I don't have a black and white answer for that, certainly. I think at this particular place, what we're doing, we had a giant monolith. And one of the things we did was starting to break that up because we had hundreds of developers and not all of them could kind of support the monolith. We also introduced a opt-in to begin with, developer support or developer on call program so that people would start to get access to that, and we kind of tried to soft launch that.
So a couple of other questions that I wanted to dig into with you, Stig, is that, for those listening that are part of a team right now and might feel like they've advocated for maybe making some improvements that would to their code base, but maybe they've heard not right now, maybe later. We'll come back to that at some point. Maybe we can't prioritize that right now. And so they've done that a couple times in the last, say, a year or two. And their perception is that, like, well, I've asked a few times and I've heard not right now. So they stop asking. And do you have any advice on how they could maybe get past that and try asking again, or maybe rethinking how they're going to approach that conversation?
I think it needs to be a conversation with the team. Any work that needs enabling work, that really should be factored into the original planning. If you need to do some cleanup work or enabling work, that needs to be factored in. It's definitely not easy at all times. Sometimes you might need to do a quick fix, but it is very important to get it on the board. And I know that some companies have a new features to maintain and maintenance and escalation. A couple of companies I've worked at has had this kind of mix that they're trying to target. So digging into those and making sure that, well, are we actually spending more on new features than maintainability than what we're supposed to aim for? Then you've got a good case for spending some more time on that, right? And they might come back and say that the maintenance is an upper limit rather than but you can try it at least. I think it is a conversation that can be very difficult, but it is necessary. If you want it to be sustainable, if you want the work to be sustainable, you have to do work to actually maintain it. If you want a well-maintained software, you have to maintain it, right? I think that's the pithy version of the phrase. So there's a thing with tech debt that I wanted to just briefly talk about. I think there's two, well, you can argue about whether it's a good metaphor or not. It's interesting that you can take the metaphor quite far. There's at least two types of tech debt. There's the intentional tech debt. This would be your mortgage or car loan or something, right? Maybe you pick up a piece of software that you're not familiar with, but you know that this will enable you to go faster. I don't want to mention any because I don't want to talk ill about any particular project, but maybe it's a project that isn't particularly fun to operate, but you take the hit because it does what you need and it will allow you to the rest of your project or product to be cleanly abstracted or something. And then the other, that's kind of, the interest payments are regular. You know how that works. You know what you're getting into. You've planned about it. You've kind of seen the brochure and everything. And there's the other one, credit card debt. You maybe just overspend a little all the time, or an overspending would probably be neglect, right? So you don't keep up with bumping your dependencies, or you don't do the fix-ups. When you do a quick fix, you don't go back and refactor the code so that it's now more robust. Maybe you introduced something that made it a bit more fragile or something. And after a long time, you suddenly can't service that credit card debt because that has much higher interest, right? And then it suddenly becomes a screaming emergency. And that could take the form of a CVE, for example, a vulnerability in an ancient version of a library that you use. And you have to bump it 3 or 4 major versions, and that's incompatible with how you use the library. So now you're scrambling to update this in all places because maybe you can't simply load the new version as well as the old version. You have to update all call sites because you're not using SBJSON, and then you have a problem. And that could be very time consuming and could put you could subject you to more risk for longer while you're scrambling to fix this, right? And the fix might be risky and break other things itself because the calling semantics have changed or something like that.
Hey again, it's me, Robby, and I just want to take a moment to plug my own company, Planet Argon. Do you have a legacy Ruby on Rails application? maybe running on an older version and you need help modernizing it? Are you trying to think through how are we going to get to Hotwire and Rails 7.1 or 8 in the near future? Get in touch with us at planetargon.com. Again, that's planetargon.com. We're here to help. I'm curious, as you think about technical debt, do you feel like how you think about it has evolved over the years? You might have felt it was used to classify, you talk about two types of technical debt, kind of how you see these two buckets now. If you go back early in your career, did it feel like something different at one point and you're like now, like, I don't think that's technical debt anymore? Is that evolved much?
Yes, I think so. There's definitely a feeling earlier on in my career that any code I didn't like or something was tech debt, right? But I don't subscribe to that anymore. I think it could be legacy code, which is not necessarily tech debt. If it doesn't actually cost you anything, it sits there, chugs along, does what it's supposed to do. It's not necessarily tech debt. It's just not something you ever need to think about. And in the past, I probably would have called that tech debt, but I don't really think of it that way now. I also think that there's really a difference between tech debt and a bad decision, right? I think the thing about tech debt, it should be intentional, unless it's that kind of, and the other tech debt, it would be through neglect. So you'd get, or kind of, you've got the intentional tech debt that you absolutely know about. It's well documented and stuff like that. I just don't subscribe to everything unpopular being tech debt anymore.
I witnessed that a lot over the years, and I think I'm guilty of that myself early on. I'm thinking, well, if someone else wrote this 5 years ago and I would have done it differently, is that technical debt or just code that I just disagree with? And it also speaks back to my perception of like how maybe I or some other developers I've worked with over the years, there's that soft bell curve of confidence, and it's like there's this interesting, I'm going to air quote, sweet spot where you're a little overconfident and a little judgy about your predecessor's code. And I think over time, I don't know about for you, but I have a lot more empathy for the developers that worked on those projects. I'm like, I don't know what they were thinking, or they did the best they could. Was it a bad decision? Maybe not at the time, but now maybe it doesn't make sense. Today's tooling or knowledge, or that person was new to this particular framework or tech library or programming language, and this was like their first time in there, and they were trying to use their existing skill set and apply it to this new technology, new to them technology. And you might do it differently now that you know better take advantage of the technology. So I relate to that a lot, is basically what I'm trying to say.
I absolutely agree. Remember, I got some feedback about 12 years ago in a job that I'd kind of matured quite a bit, and I was a new dad at the time, and I think part of the thing was that I realized that there was something that was quite a lot more important than code about, and it made me a lot of interesting problems. They're not really code problems, they are people problems.
So a couple of quick last questions for you. Is there a non-software, non-programming, non-technical book that you find yourself recommending to your peers?
Yes. I'm quite a voracious reader. I was thinking of one that I wanted to recommend, which is called The Scout Mindset by Julia Galef. It's about describing the motivation to see things the way they are rather than as you wish they were. And this kind of contrasted with the mindset of a soldier who employs motivated reasoning to aggressively defend their existing beliefs and ignore contradicting evidence. And I found it quite interesting. The one example that blew me away was from cholera epidemic in London in the 1850s. The London homeopathic hospital reported a cholera mortality rate much lower than the other hospitals, and they were ignored. The council just ignored their stat. They thought they must obviously be lying. Turns out they weren't. Their success just had nothing to do with homeopathy. They were keen on clean linen. And cholera is a disease that you get from contamination. So it was purely accident, but the result was real.
That's interesting. Yeah, I'll include links to that. And you said this, the Scout Mindset, right? Yeah, I'm gonna have to check that book out myself. That sounds interesting. And where can listeners best follow your thoughts and ruminations about software engineering online?
It will be tough. I do have a blog. I blog on Brautaset.org, but I've managed a whole blog post this year, and I think 2 last year. So I'm not a very prolific blogger, and I don't always blog about tech. I'm on the Lobsters forum. That's probably where you can interact with me the most.
Okay, great. I'll definitely include links to all of that for all of our listeners. And with that, it's been such a delight having you join us on Maintainable, Stig. Thank you so much for stopping by to Talk Shop.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a blast.
Maintainable.